Good morning, everyone. If we can take our seats, we'll begin the meeting. Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this, our second meeting of the Community and Protective Services Committee. We are going to start the morning here first with a presentation. So I will just move to the podium to get that started. All right. So as I mentioned, we have the pleasure this morning of starting with a ceremonial presentation where we are recognizing 3 City of Ottawa residents with the Life-Saving Society's Rescue Award of Merit. Amanda Milabrio, Mateo Decorado, and Scott Labrose. These individuals, who are trained lifeguards, use their judgment and skills to intervene in emergency situations. Off-duty and in unfamiliar environments, and without the typical life-saving equipment available to our city lifeguards, they chose to act when it mattered the most. I'd like to introduce Mr. Sean Duffy from the Life-Saving Society of Ontario branch to present our award recipients. Sean?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, members of council, city staff, residents, and special guests. Bonjour. My name is Sean Duffy, and I'm the Ottawa Area Chair for the Life-Saving Society Ontario branch. Je m'appelle Sean Duffy, et je suis le président régional pour la Société de sauvetage de l'Ontario, ici en Ottawa. It's an honor and privilege to stand before you today. The Life-Saving Society is a national volunteer organization and registered charity, and the Society trains and certifies Canada's national lifeguards. La Société de sauvetage est un organisme à but non lucratif dont la mission est de favoriser les interactions sécuritaires avec l'eau afin de prévenir la noyade et les autres traumatismes. La noyade est un problème évitable. Locally, the Life-Saving Society is a proud member of the Ottawa Drowning Prevention Coalition, working alongside city departments and external partners to educate residents in the National Capital Region about water safety. The Life-Saving Society would not be able to achieve our drowning prevention mission without the tireless work of our members, including the City of Ottawa, our municipal affiliate member with one of the largest life-saving training programs in Ontario. For 2018, the City of Ottawa has once again been awarded the Life-Saving Society's prestigious Arthur Lewis Cochrane Cup. Over time, we have developed a strong life-saving culture in Ottawa, and we see members of the Life-Saving Society amongst the City Council and the City staff and here in the public. Through investment in swimming lessons and life-saving certification programs, the city develops and trains a team of citizens and staff ready to intervene in emergency situations. Occasionally, we have the opportunity to recognize these individuals who step up to help those in need. Il me fait plaisir d'être ici avec vous aujourd'hui pour reconnaître quelques interventions importantes. The Life-Saving Society's Rescue Award of Merit honors individuals involved in water-related rescues and Life-Saving Society award holders in non-aquatic rescue situations as well. We have 3 Rescue Award of Merits to present today. For each recipient, I will read the award citation and then invite the recipient up to receive the award from Councillor Suds. This will be followed by a brief photograph. Thank you. Our first recipient is Amanda Milabrio. Amanda was enjoying her first swim at Waikiki Beach in Hawaii with her sister Julia on August 23, 2017. As they set out into the surf, Amanda warned Julia about the strength of the wind and waves and told her to stay close to shore. Julia opted not to heed her sister's advice and swam further out until the strength of the crashing waves and current became too much. Julia began to struggle to stay afloat and eventually submerged. Fortunately, Amanda, who holds the Life-Saving Society's National Lifeguard and Life-Saving Instructor certifications, had accompanied her sister into deep water on a flotation device to keep an eye on her. Recognizing her sister was in trouble, she jumped off the flotation device and swam to Julia. She approached from behind, wrapped her arms around her, and brought her to the surface, exactly as trained. Amanda towed Julia back to the flotation device and helped her climb onto it before swimming the two of them back to shore. Once they were safely back on the beach, Amanda treated Julia for shock and called for a medical team, all while keeping her sister calm and out of the sun. Within a half hour, Julia had recovered and required no further medical treatment. Madam Chair, Mesdames et Messieurs, je vous présente Ms. Amanda Miliambro. Our next recipient is Matteo Di Corrado. Thank you. Matteo was on Frigate Bay Beach on the Caribbean island of St. Kitts and Nevis on January 4th, 2018, when he heard panicked voices surrounding a man who was pulled from the water minutes prior. The victim was found face down, vital signs absent. Matteo, a head lifeguard and instructor with the City of Ottawa, took over the frantic scene. He managed and mitigated the growing panic of the people around the victim, delegated someone to call emergency services, and began CPR. It took emergency services 25 minutes to arrive, at which point they provided Matteo with an AED that was barely charged, a broken bag valve mask, and an apparent lack of knowledge as to how to assist in the matter at hand. Matteo continued CPR for 45 minutes as the emergency service personnel fumbled through the rescue procedures, which included incorrectly placing the AED pads on the victim. The first attempt at a shock failed due to the AED's low battery. A subsequent attempt delivered a weak shock, which also traveled through Matteo because the victim and dock surfaces were so wet. Matteo implored the emergency crew to take the victim to the hospital. They finally brought him to the ambulance, but discontinued any life-saving attempts. For his willingness to intervene in the face of overwhelming odds, Madam Chair, ladies and gentlemen, je vous présente Mr. Matteo Di Corrado. We now have Scott Labros. Scott was enjoying Canada Day with friends and family near L'Île Patrie in Quebec on July 1st, 2018, when he was alerted that his partner Casey had been badly injured. Casey had been suntanning on an inflatable raft on a Gatineau River. As she was floating, a stranger on a personal watercraft approached her and the people around her. In an attempt to splash the group, the driver drove recklessly close to Casey, striking her with the watercraft before fleeing the scene. Scott, a former national lifeguard, took immediate action. With the help from friends, Scott pulled Casey from the water. She was unconscious and bleeding severely. Scott began CPR immediately and ultimately resuscitated Casey. Scott's immediate intervention allowed precious time for emergency services to arrive to take over and transport Casey to hospital, where she was diagnosed with a fractured skull and brain trauma. In the weeks that followed, Casey underwent multiple brain surgeries on her way to recovery, thanks in part to Scott's life-saving know-how and quick life-saving intervention. Madam Chair, Mesdames et Messieurs, je vous présente Mr. Scott Labros. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Madam Chair. As we see from these stories, each of these individuals has embodied the Life-Saving Society's motto: whomsoever you see in distress, recognize in them a fellow human being. The city's continued investment in safe swimming spaces and training equipment, and the passionate teams working in aquatic services and other departments have allowed us to make a measurable difference in keeping our citizens safe in, on, and around the water. I would like to invite the award recipients and their guests to join us in the Billings room just down the hall from here in the main building for photos and refreshments. Merci.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Sean, and again, a big congratulations to the three recipients. I know our committee is very proud of these award recipients and all the others as well across our city who work every day to prevent drowning and water-related injuries. So thank you. Okay, now moving back to the next item on the agenda. Any declarations of interest? Okay. Seeing none. Confirmation of the minutes from February 21st, 2019. Carried. Communications, there is a response to inquiries. Geese population control, CPS 0318. Received. Moving to item number 2 on the agenda, status update, committee inquiries and motions for the period ending March 2019. Received? Okay, and item number 3. So today we are going to consider how to allocate the Vehicle for Hire Accessibility Fund. Since 2017, the fund has accumulated $1.2 million to be used to offset the cost of accessible transportation programs. Geographically speaking, of course, Ottawa is a large city, and some of our most vulnerable residents face real challenges in getting around our city. We must ensure that residents with disabilities and mobility issues can access safe, affordable, and timely transportation services. Residents who use accessible transportation services shared many innovative ideas on how we should use these funds to best meet their needs. I'm pleased that the ideas being recommended today are some of the highest ranked ideas coming from the public consultations. The recommendations will help the city expand and enhance accessible transportation services while also making them more affordable. I'd remind members of the committee that the issue before us today is how to spend these funds that have accumulated. Questions relating to the Vehicle for Hire bylaw and enforcement are out of scope for this discussion. I'd now like to invite Anthony DeMonte, General Manager of Emergency and Protective Services, to give a short presentation about the funds and recommended ideas.
Thank you, Chair. Merci, Madame la Présidente. Bonjour, membres du comité. I'd like to introduce Leslie Charles will be here, my assistant, moving the slides forward and getting this presentation along. Direction was given from Council when the Vehicle for Hire bylaw was passed in April 2016 to continue work on accessibility as PTCs were added to the Ottawa market. This report provides the outcome of this work and is solely focused on the Accessibility Fund and recommendations from the steering committee that was created on how to assign those funds. Next slide. Here's a high-level overview of the background of the development of these recommendations. I think it's important to review. It's been some time since the Accessibility Fund, as you mentioned, was accumulating. A lot of work has gone in. So initially we had to negotiate the levy. I remind members of committee, under the Municipal Act, we have no authority to impose PTCs with an accessibility levy, and so it was a negotiated process that we did with our PTC partners. At the time, however, Council did direct the clerk to write to the province of Ontario for powers under the Municipal Act. We've not received any follow-up to that communication, and it is still outstanding. But we were able to negotiate with our PTC partners, initially Uber, and then the other partner. I'm sorry, I forget. Lyft, I apologize. I apologize to Lyft if they're in the audience. Lyft as well, and there are others that have been discussing with us but have not yet entered the market. Steering committee was established as per council direction. We conducted public consultations, completed analysis and summaries, conducted internal feasibility analysis for all departments. Part of the steering committee's questions was, is a lot of this work able to be accomplished within departmental budgets, and is it part of some of the department's responsibilities? Therefore, we shouldn't take this fund to do that. We should take this fund to bonify or find other solutions for the community. And the steering committee met then to provide final recommendations that you have before you today, how to spend the funds, and we'll be discussing that shortly. So the steering committee was defined by council in the work that you asked us to do. It was a broad membership. A mandate was to develop a consultation strategy and then recommend how the funds would be spent. The fund is meant to assist with costs for accessibility transportation programs, both new and existing, and that is what the committee and the steering committee focused on. Public consultations were done through several different channels, in addition to an online survey and in-person sessions. Staff also received emails and phone calls, which were included in the analysis to allow members of the community all opportunities to participate in the consultation process. And it was important for the committee to ensure that we found ways that anybody who wanted to participate could, and all those comments were considered. Finally, a feasibility analysis. The 29 ideas were reviewed using the following process. Internal staff conducted feasibility analysis that met the criteria of the fund. Questions were asked and considered, and the steering committee used this public consultation process and the feasibility analysis internally to put together the debate and the discussions that we had to make the recommendations before you today. In conclusion, the Vehicle for Hire Accessibility Fund Steering Committee recommends funds for rural transportation, smartphone application, and the taxi coupon program. These 4 ideas were in the top 8 of all the ideas provided by the public. They met the guidelining principles that the public worked with when they had their workshops, met the operational department feasibility analysis of what could be done, what was possible, and what was already being done, so we wouldn't have to use this money. And finally, more importantly, conform to council direction supporting the accessible transportation. Merci beaucoup. Thank you. Pleased to take any questions.
Thank you very much. Now questions from the committee, and I'll go to Councillor Aglai first.
Thank you very much. Mr. Monte, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about the app development, in particular how many dollars are set aside for that?
So during the consultation process, the steering committee was heard a lot from the community with regards to paratranspo, and more importantly, some of the members of the community were saying when they had booked a paratranspo vehicle and they were outside, whether it was in the cold, they never really knew when the vehicle was arriving. So that seemed to be a huge issue, and in discussion, our colleagues from paratranspo were part of the steering committee. The discussion of an app came into play, and at the time it was $100,000 that was set aside to be able to develop that app.
Okay, thank you. And is somebody from OC Transpo here today?
Yes, I believe Mr. Scrimger is here to take questions. Pat, can you maybe come up?
Just a quick follow-up to that. Thank you, Mr. Grimsher. And we've had some discussions recently around this. Am I correct that OC Transpo is able to take on the development of this app within their own resources?
Madam Chair, we have a project which will be beginning this year to develop an online service, and we hope an app to provide a number of services for paratransport customers. We would certainly build the effort to build this function into that same work. If we'll be doing that within existing capital authority approved by council. If this additional funding is provided, that will just provide more cushion to do the work. If this funding were allocated differently, we'd continue to do this work within the capital authority that already exists.
So you are able to do it within your budget. So what I'd like to suggest is an amendment to the recommendation, Madam Chair, and put forward a motion that I've talked to Mr. DeMonte about a little bit over the last couple of days, which would take that $100,000 and put that back into the main fund to be dispersed amongst the three other options, and then allow OC Transpo within their own resources to develop the app. I believe this is something that you support, if I'm...
Madam Chair, we've had discussions with the council and with our colleagues at OC, and that is something we would be supportive, as long as Mr. Scrimger indicated, they could continue doing the work. The steering committee was adamant that that work needed to be done. What we're hearing is yes, so we would be supportive of that.
Okay, so if I can just, and I can also say, Madam Chair, that I've spoken to our council liaison as well, Matt Luloff, and Matt's indicated his support for this approach as well, as being responsive to the accessibility community and what they're looking for. I'll dispense with the whereases, but the body of the motion, or the meat of the motion, is therefore be it resolved that no funds from the Vehicle for Hire Accessibility Fund be allocated to the creation of the Paratranspo smartphone application, and be it further resolved that the General Manager of Emergency and Protective Services be given the delegated authority to reallocate the funds for the Paratranspo smartphone application to the remaining recommendations outlined in the report. And again, that's predicated on the answers given today by both Mr. DeMonte and Mr. Scrimger that OC Transpo was able within its own resources to develop this app, and therefore that would free up the $100,000 to be distributed amongst taxi coupons and the other initiatives. So I'll just introduce that at this point, and those are my questions. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you very much. Councillor El Chantieri.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just on the motion from my colleague, and I'm glad staff in support of that motion, but when you talk about develop smartphone app for paratransport, is that, and Mr. Scrimmage, you can correct us here, your clientele, do I assume they all have the smartphone on them?
An increasing number of our customers do. They don't all, but as time goes on, more and more people have smartphone apps. What we'll be developing is a number of online services that could be done either from a computer or from a smartphone, as well as, if necessary, we'll be making recommendations to Transit Commission on any policies required to make sure that people who have smartphones don't get preferential treatment over those who don't have access or who have a disability that prevents them from using an online service.
So that means you're not catching all your clientele with that app. That app alone is not going to be able to serve everyone unless we buy them a smartphone.
I think that's right, yes.
So is there another way to do this? Is there another way where the person on the other side of the phone can tell them how long they should wait? Because the biggest complaint we hear, they go outside the hospital and they wait outside without any information when is their buses coming.
Madam Chair, yes, that function already exists. What we'd be doing by making these online services available is allowing customers to get that information directly without the need to talk to staff at our customer service center. Right now, in order to get that information, they have to call the customer service center, and sometimes that means that they're in the queue along with other people who are calling for different reasons, so that a customer service center can assist them. The more services that we can move so the customers can exercise that function or make that transaction directly, first of all, those people will be bypassing the queue for the phone center, and second, it'll be reducing pressure on the phone center, because those people can get that information or conduct that transaction themselves.
And when would you be reporting back to this committee to see how is that working out for you? The app and other, I'd just like to know, is going to be a follow-up on this?
Our view is that if there's no allocation to that project from this committee, our reporting back would be to the Transit Commission.
I'm a little bit
Madam Chair, I'm at your discussion, but with the clerk, I'm sure we could find a way. I think it's appropriate. Mr. Scrimger should be reporting back to his committee, but because of the questions of this committee, that we could, I could kind of be the liaison and report back the work that was done to answer the councillor's request. But we'll work with the clerk to perhaps do that, if that's all right with the councillor, to ensure that this committee gets a follow-up, because it would be reported back to Transportation Committee.
Well, I would like to follow up. I'd like to see how it's working for us in this regard. How many people are using the app? How many people are still using it? That information is going to be helpful for us to have.
Chair, again, to perhaps reassure the councillor, it was really clear in the public consultation. So as well, I don't have the data to know how many people have smartphones, but it was clear that the community said they wanted that tool and that they wanted to be able to look on their smartphone and see how far para was there. So I would suspect the majority of those members of that community have smartphones, but there is a percentage that wouldn't. But we could report back, Chair, if you wish.
If I can follow up, Mr. DeMonte, through the chair, you talk about 139 people participate in that consultation. Out of how many people in disability, or I mean, in that accessibility and community, like that number is kind of very low.
Yeah, so the 137 participants were all those that used, 57% used mobility devices, wheelchairs. We're really targeting that community. There were 5 public sessions we did online. I also remind you, Chair, that on the steering committee there was our accessibility office that was there, and they distributed that to all the community, as well as members of the accessibility representatives, Brian Wade and Adele Fury, that were also there representing the community at large. So we felt that this was a broad representation. I can't tell you what that 130 people represented the broad community, but I think we were able to, and again, our accessibility advisory office here sent it to every contact that they have. So it was a broad analysis of what the community wanted.
If I can follow up outside the motion, Madam Chair, we're hearing time and time again from the accessibility community. There's a lot of drivers who have that accessibility license. They are returning them to the city for whatever reason, because they're not whatever. But I heard there's a number. I asked for the number, and it's quite a bit of number came back to the city from the number of the accessibility plate. So is that creating a gap somewhere, or? And I also, we're hearing from our resident, some of these folks, they're only working from 9 to 5. Accessibility is 24/7. So what's your thought about this one?
Chair, that's actually something that we've heard from several members of this committee, that you've heard from your constituents. And last September, Bylaw and Regulatory Services begun an analysis of what's going on. So twofold. First, your answer. Of all the accessibility plates that we do have, there are only 2 outstanding that haven't yet been given out. The rest are all fulfilled. And as you remember, there was a ratio of percentage of population. So the plates are out there. It's not a question of, there has been some movement, but I don't think that's a challenge. I think you've hit the nail on the head. We've heard the same issues. We're doing an analysis right now. There are parameters in the bylaw where if you're an owner of an accessible plate, you're supposed to work at least 10 hours, 5 days a week. And the 100 and some odd plates that we have out there should be out there. We have, there's some enforcement activity. I'm just going to be a little careful because there have been some charges laid that people are not fulfilling their responsibility, and there's other enforcement activity underway. And I'm going to perhaps turn it over to our Director of Bylaw and Regulatory Services, Mr. Chapman. So directly your question, I think there's enough. The percentage is good. There's a couple outstanding. We've got a couple more plates that we can give out. That doesn't seem to be the challenge. I think people are not necessarily fulfilling their responsibility, and we have authorities to do things with that. I'll turn it over to Roger, and then I'll conclude in that, Madam Chair.
Yes, Madam Chair, what we're finding right now is that even though the 5 days a week, 10 hours a day is a requirement of the bylaw, the on-demand accessible service is still not meeting the requirements from the accessible community during peak hours and weekends in particular. Most of the accessible plates are on the road between 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. Monday to Friday. So they are meeting the requirements of the bylaw, but again, not meeting the demand from the accessible community because there's fewer accessible vehicles on the road after hours.
So if I understand, the bylaw is to work 10 hours a day, so many days a week. But if they all work from 6 to 6, so that means from the other 6 to 6, a lot of them is not working, and it's not available, that service. Is that what you're saying?
Madam Chair, that's correct. What I can tell you is that we are working with the brokers and trying to find ways to increase the amount of accessible vehicles that are on the road to be able to respond to those calls from the accessible community after hours and on weekends.
Well, maybe general manager need to either had a meeting with the owners, the plate owners, or because we hear time and time again, some of the accessibility call, they have to wait for the car to come from Orleans all the way to Canada or to West Carleton, because those folks who they know in the area, but they choose to log off or not pick up the call. It's got to be a better way just to say, well, we're okay, we'll give you the free plate as long as you work 10 hours a day, but that 10 hours a day could be all of them working during the day and no one covering the other shift. And I'm not sure if that's really a service to the community.
Yeah, Chair, the councillor raises a good point. There are some challenges with that. As you know, they've got collective agreements and these rules that we have to kind of respect and be careful of, if not enter the labor relations issues with the plate owners. But there's other challenges too that Mr. Chapman, and I know I'm going to be careful here not to enter into, so there's investigations underway and there have been some charges laid about the percentages. So we know that 30% of the accessible plates also work with our colleagues at OC Transpo, right, in planned movements. So that's one percentage. So there's still 70% of those plates that should be available to do. We're discovering, and some of the charges have been laid in other investigations, that some of these accessible plate owners are finding other methods to be available and not be available for accessible transport, but rather, you know, we'll go to the airport and hail calls, that type of thing, which is not appropriate. So we're intervening on that. We're going to close that gap. And yes, we've, as Mr. Chapman has indicated, we've started discussions with the brokers to try to resolve the other issue. So we know it's a problem. We've heard it from many members of committee, and you've heard it from your constituents. And we actually heard it in the public consultation process as well, that they said, yeah, it's great, the accessible cabs, but they're not available and there's long delays sometimes. So we're looking at that right now.
Okay, Madam Chair, I know you said you didn't want to talk about the whether the taxi bylaw or the ride share bylaw, and I'm okay with that, but this report is coming from that. So the money we collected, it collected from a policy this or the previous council put in place. So now we're only talking about $100,000 out of the $1.2 million. What about the rest of the money? Is there's going to be a report review to what, since the right sharing, what happened, and that money supposed to be reinvested in accessibility? What is the overall plan? Okay, we heard the 100,000. We heard those apps going to be available to someone who have smartphone. What about other?
So, Madam Chair, just to be clear, council direction was to do this process and come back to you with regard to that. So on an annual basis, we'll have about $720,000 based on the current trip data that we have. So we've accumulated 1.2 right now, and that'll be distributed. When we look at if the councillor's motion, when you vote on it, passes and we take that extra 100,000, it'll go back in the bucket and it'll be distributed to the other recommendations that the steering committee, if you approve today, it'll go back to that. So to reduce the cost of the taxi coupons, increase the maximum allowance of taxi coupons, and then the non-for-profit. The other thing that we heard in the public consultations in the rural communities, Paratranspo does not transport from, I don't know, if you live in West Carleton, that type
rural to rural, they don't do that.
Correct. So there'll be an investment in those community agencies. They're currently getting $600,000 from the city through our transportation group. So some of this money will go to them. We have to talk to them because they said they have limited capacity to increase, but they're very interested in talking. So a big part of that will help that issue. The rest will go to taxi and taxi coupons. The other thing that we heard, and we talk about it in the report, the community was saying, you or I as able-bodied people, if we decide after this committee to go out to lunch and hail a cab and go somewhere, they don't have that flexibility, and that's what they're looking for. And accessible cabs is the solution to that, mis à part what we've just discussed. So if they were all available, the problem they have is the barrier to cost is still too high. So the investment in that, of lowering the cost of the taxi chit and having more of them, allows them more of that flexibility, and that's what they were looking for. So that's where the money will be essentially going.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Fleury.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. I want to thank my colleague because these issues are very important. I'm hearing specifically that there's not much money to be made in the context of accessible taxi cabs. So in that context, I turn my questions, and really I should begin by saying we don't have a delegation today. So that means, in my mind, as a member of this committee, that staff have done a really good job, because you would see a lot of members of the accessibility community here today if there were concerns. So I would caution us on changing the proposal based on the feedback that committee received. So I'll preface my question to you, Mr. DeMonte or Mr. Scrimger, by setting out a context. When I hear of Paratranspo, I hear that it's complicated to book and that it's long to wait for. So in that context, punt as much money as you can into OC Transpo to fast track that resolution so that our customers, our accessibility customers, can resolve those pieces. So for me, when you bring the application component up, I want to make sure that we don't forget the GPS is one item, but the booking and payments are other items that are as relevant for that community. And I wouldn't want us to come in and resolve one issue when there's really a range of outstanding issues that could help in terms of our accessibility and in terms of our modernization and that client experience.
Chair, again, and I'll let Mr. Scrimger talk in a moment. For context, this is important debate. For context, too, my impression of what the community was saying is both products are very different products and meet two different needs. Paratranspo, you know, you book your scheduled appointment, and that, mis à part some of the challenges of their, I don't know when they're arriving, and hopefully we take care of that. And then the accessible cab is one of more flexibility, more of being what I was hearing from when they were talking in some of the workshops is, I want to be more like an able-bodied person, that I can make a spontaneous decision and get a cab, but the barrier to that is too high from a cost perspective. So that was the other bucket. And so that's kind of what we were hearing from the community, and that's why the steering committee, when we had the debate, these were some of the discussions the steering committee came up with both these options. And so that's what's before you today, to help kind of situate a bit of the debate as we're having. But I'll turn over to Mr. Scrimger more on some of the para challenges.
Excuse me, Madam Chair, just to reiterate, the work that we've outlined to the Transit Commission that we'll be doing and reporting back to them later this year is to find online functions such as outlined here, getting arrival time, booking trips, administering one's ParaPay account, canceling trips, doing as many transactions as possible directly through a phone app or online on a computer, to take the pressure off and to reduce the queue length of people calling in to the customer service center. The question of how much capacity there is on the Paratranspo system is one that was discussed at the budget meeting of the Transit Commission, where we advised that there would be sufficient budget in the 2019, sufficient funds in the 2019 budget to continue to provide the same level of service, which did match the level of demand in 2018. Other paratransport issues, such as the reliability of service, the travel time, are really a function of how the road network is working. We expect some improvement in that as construction ends on a number of fronts and as there's fewer buses on downtown streets. But for the large part, it's going to be the availability of the kind of information that's here to customers so that they can get some idea of when that minibus or contracted cab is actually going to get to them. That'll help them to de-stress their life.
So I just want to clarify what's in front of us today. Because of the funds that we receive from these organizations that aren't providing accessible services, we get a chunk of money, and we're looking at how we're going to spend that money. I want to make sure that we're in scope, and to your second point, I'm focused on OC Transpo, not that my colleague El Shantiri covered that part of the issue very well, and I want to support him in that, but from the paratranspo use of the component, I want to make sure that we go beyond what we're trying to do here. So are we able to, would it be in scope today for committee to extend the direction to staff to go beyond the GPS and push that app be allowing for reservations, for payments, for accessible purposes? And the reason, before you answer, the purpose of this in my mind, and I don't know all of OC Transpo's work plan in fairness, but what a great group to do a focus on, to pilot how we can do payment online through Presto app and so on through that application before we merge into the broader user base. So it's a smaller group of users, and I think we should really modernize the technology with that group. It's a safe environment. I feel like it's the group that's so they can't even pay through Presto right now, so they're already so much behind that I'd love to just put more money so that we can get that application to them in an efficient way.
Chair, the committee's sovereign in deciding what it wishes to do with this. What we heard and what the steering committee is providing as recommendations, if we take the $100,000 and reinvest it here, Mr. Scrimgeour and his team are saying they can do the work that was defined there. I think what Councillor Fleury is saying is he wants to expand that, and if I understand right, and be even more proactive. Yes, we could return that $100,000 if that helps Mr. Scrimgeour, because that's what the steering committee had already recommended, or whatever you wish to do. But I don't know, is that capacity in their work plan available? I think that question is, and I don't want to put you on the spot, Pat, but I think the question is more with Mr. Scrimgeour and their work plan and where they're at with, in the steps and the approach that they need to take. They got to have a foundation to be able, I think, to do that more advanced work. But I'll let him talk about that. But with regards to the money, we could absolutely have that discussion and redirect it there if you wish.
So, Madam Chair, just to be clear, we are intending to do that work. We've outlined that work to the Transit Commission. We believe that work is sufficiently funded within the existing capital authority. If this committee chooses to allocate this funding to supplement the existing capital authority, then that would just reduce limits on what we're doing, but we would not know till we got further into the project just exactly how much money we'll require. Our intent is to do all of the things that the councillors mentioned, whether or not this funding is approved.
And Pat, you would see these improvements effective for paratransport customers this year?
We'll be reporting to the Transit Commission later this year on a project scope and a project expectations. I would not be able to estimate a timeline at this point.
So for me, I think the committee doesn't need to make a decision. Let's leave the scope as is with the intent of the conversation, and if we realize later in the year that those funds are allocated, but for me, we want to see a customer experience shift for para based on we have a bit of money here sooner. So let's leave that money there. Let's expand the scope. Let's push Pat to put it in, an OC to put it in place this year. That's what I would push for. Now, there was another question that was raised relating to technology, and as chair of OCH, I think it's important for everyone to know this data. In 2015, Ottawa Community Housing did a survey amongst the residents. We didn't differentiate between seniors versus youth versus families and so on. But at that time, in 2015, 73% of residents within OCH had access to internet in their home and had a smartphone. So it's important when we look at that population to know that when we look at para, seniors, low income, that more and more every year the technology adoption is raising. So we can't stop the shift towards modernizing the experience for customers.
Thank you, Councillor Fleury. Next, Councillor McKenney.
Thank you, Chair. I noted that, and I just want to make sure that I'm clear so that I can better understand the motion that's in front of us and as I consider it. So when you looked at all 33 improvements that were recommended and prioritized, I think number 6 was improving paratransport payment systems, processes, online booking. So I just want to confirm that, maybe through Mr. Scrimger, that is within the scope of your work plan for this year. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
Okay. So we've been able to knock off number 6 as a result of Para's work plan. Is that?
That's correct.
Okay,
Chair.
thank you. Because that is, is our number one concern that we hear from people, is that they can't book online. And we know that there's been a lot of back and forth on that and the reasons why we haven't moved earlier. But it also seems to me when I go through all of the improvements that have been asked for, they all cost money. They all cost a little bit of money, not a lot of money. So I wonder why we asked for that voluntary contribution of only 7 cents and nothing close to the 30 cents that KPMG had suggested. And if you know, I know that some American cities have a much higher cost, but I don't know about Canadian cities. I wasn't able to find that background. Do you know that? And can you tell me why they're only 7 cents?
Yeah, so Chair, it goes back to, so the other motion, I talked about the motion about changing, lobbying the government to allow us to change the Municipal Act. So currently in the Municipal Act, we have no authority to impose a levy. So when Council gave this direction, it was very much, you're going to negotiate pretty much without a hammer either. So the negotiations ended up with 7 cents. When we did look at other municipalities in Ontario, I think it was London and all that, we're kind of all in the same ballpark with a volunteer levy. Now that said, both Lyft and Uber were very open corporate partners. The negotiations went well, and that's what we ended up with, 7 cents. It doesn't compare to Chicago's 30 cents. That said, too, Chicago's market, as far as size compared to Ottawa, very different as well, too. So that was the fundamental limiting element of the capacity. The other element, too, and I know we'd had public comments and Council received from members of the community, that we should be forcing these companies to have accessible cabs. That too, there's nothing under the OA, and that also Council asked the clerk to write, and we did write to the province to change. So directly to your question, we were negotiating in good faith with partners. They came up, 7 cents is where we ended up, and it produces about $720,000 at the current base trip data that we have today. We've accumulated a little bit more once that, but annually that's what you'll be seeing, about that kind of volume of money, and that's where we ended up with the steering committee with these recommendations.
Thank you, and I can appreciate that, and if it's voluntary, it's hard to, without a hammer, have corporations cough up, funding. But there is opportunity, obviously, to go back to look for additional funds. I think that we always have to keep that, in mind, because $700,000 is nothing compared to what they pull out of the city, what their revenue generation is within the city, because we allowed them to operate legally, and they do not provide any accessibility within their services. So I still, I just want to leave it on the table that I think that 7 cents is a steal, really, from us, and I would like to see us, through you have delegated authority at this point, but I would like to see some consideration given to going back and renegotiating for more money.
Agreed, Madam Chair.
Okay, thank you. And just one last question to Mr. Scrimger then on the app. I just wonder, I guess, if it's easy to do and well within all of your current resources and work plan, why it wasn't done earlier. Like, how much, additional work? What is this going to look like? Why are we diverting away money for an app that people have asked for? And again, as Councillor Fleury pointed out, we have no delegates here today because presumably, for the most part, people are happy with the consultation. They're happy where we landed. They're happy with the recommendations that are before us. So we're changing them and not providing any opportunity for input. So can you tell me, and if you can't today, perhaps before council, before a final vote at council, what would that app look like? Would it have all of the technologies that people need that I have when I book Uber, or Lyft, I can tell, or taxi, yeah. I can tell when they're coming. They send me a notification when they've arrived. They send me something after. There's many steps. It's not just seeing a little dot moving about on a GPS. So can you give me an idea of what that app would look like within your current resources without that extra $100,000 that we're recommending here today?
Madam Chair, I can't say what the app would look like. I can say that we would be looking to include all the services, all the functions, all the features that the councillor has listed, plus more. Our goal will be to find a way of providing an online service that does everything that a paratransport customer would want to be able to use the system easily and to have confidence in it. At this point, we've undertaken to the Transit Commission that we will be doing the work this year to investigate, to report back to them on what the scope of that project would be, how we would fund that from existing capital authority, and provide them with a roadmap of how we would move on to have this app or online service developed and made available to customers. At this point, I can't say exactly what the potential vendors are capable of providing. That is a discussion we have to have with the software vendors. I can't say what it'll cost. That'll come out of our work. I can't say when it'll be online for customers. That will come out of our work too. But the commitment that our general manager made was that we would come back to the Transit Commission to report on all of these things.
But if you can't say what it will cost, then I have real concerns today about pulling money. It was a recommendation. It came out of consultation. So I do have some concerns about pulling that money out of it without having that information available to me. So I'm going to support the recommendations as they appear in the report, because I want to make sure that what our customers ask for, who require accessible services, and I know I cannot take OC Transpo without my GPS. I can't. I won't. I actually won't. I would not stand at a corner and just wonder when that bus is coming. I would never do it with a taxi, and I would never do it with Uber or Lyft. And I worry that we might be leaving people behind. So I'm going to support the recommendations as they appear in the report. Thank you.
Thank you. So we do actually have a delegation that has just signed up. I've been made aware. So I think I'll pause the conversation so we respect her time. So I will invite Grace McCullen-Crute to the spot. There's a spot just up front here. Thank you for joining us, Grace. And you have 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you for seeing me. I didn't intend to speak today. First, I'm going to tell you something about myself. I've done advocacy for the disabled for 40 years. I worked as a management consultant specialty in disabled issues and transportation. One of the things I did was a survey of 25 cities across Canada regarding wheelchair access. And just one thing to Mr. Fleury, he said there were no people here today. My husband and I make a representation for vehicles to hire when it first came out, not this, and we asked to be told about your report, and we weren't told by Vehicles for Hire. We heard about it on TV. So there may be a lot of other people in the same predicament, and this is usual for the City of Ottawa. My husband uses a wheelchair 24/7, and he has been left high and dry umpteen times. He was president of the Community Association, and he could never get a wheelchair to take him home from the Community Association meeting at night. He can't take paratransport because they may arrive an hour late, in which case staff has to stay in after an extra hour. That is the thing. He often has to call an ambulance for me early in the morning. 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock seems to be the time. He cannot follow me to hospital. There's no way, because there's no one available. I have several serious health issues. In fact, I'm in worse condition than he is, although I am chair more and more, but I can walk. But you don't think so. But he can't follow me to hospital. That's an issue. And he should have the right to follow me. And wheelchair parents should be able to follow their kids to chill. He was told by Mr. Marconi that he should call Ottawa Police and they would get him to hospital. And when we went to Ottawa Police and paratransport with Mr. Marconi's idea, they all laughed at us. And that is typical. We often get given misinformation by city staff. Now, I want to tell you something. We've used wheelchair accessible cabs from sea to sea. In Vancouver, if paratransport is going to be 15 minutes late, they send a wheelchair accessible cab and they get paid a flat rate. In Winnipeg, Spring Taxi is marvelous. And the way they treat the disabled is totally different. We are equal to the able-bodied. We're not in Ottawa. In Toronto, you can call and have paratransport at your house. You don't have to do this long booking. What on earth is wrong with Ottawa? Why won't you spend the money for it? And you know what? When I talked to the owner of Spring Taxi in Winnipeg, he didn't see that taxis weren't economical. He didn't think that he was losing money. Now, Vancouver Taxi in Vancouver is all wheelchair accessible cabs. But, you know, they told us about using it for bands, and, you know, because, you know, if you have a double bass, you need something. And they drive all kinds of other things, and they just don't see it. But Ottawa is totally different, and that's why I say it's systemic discrimination. And I want to finish with one thing that's going to displease you all. But this guiding principle of affordability that says that ensure that public transportation costs individuals for persons with mobility disabilities is equal or less to transportation costs for other individuals is discriminatory. When under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, Clause 15, look at it, and you should all know it, because you are discriminating against the disabled. And don't forget, and I was very proud of us when we said it is so important that our Francophone brothers and sisters participate, that we won't cost out the cost of doing things in 2 languages, translation. But now you're saying to the disabled, it's going to cost you out. You have to provide paratransport equal to Toronto and send a wheelchair accessible cab. If you sent wheelchair accessible cabs every time paratransport was 15 minutes late, wheelchair accessible cabs would have plenty of business in Ottawa. And if you're not ready to do that for us, I'm sorry. And that's why I see no hope. And I know of people who got on with the federal government and left because they said, I can't have a career on a life in Ottawa because I'm in a wheelchair. That's disgusting.
Thank you.
For the City of Ottawa.
Thank you, Grace, for joining us, sharing those thoughts. Any questions of the delegation? Councillor Rudolph?
Thank you so much for coming and sharing that with us today. I really appreciate it. I realize that there's a lot more work to be done, and I look forward to working with the advisory committee to see what we can do. We're dealing with a very narrow scope today, so I want to put the question to you on Councillor Eglai's motion, this $100,000. Do you think that it would be better to put that into taxi chits for cabs for the disabled, or would you rather have an app and know when your paratransport bus is going to show up? How would you spend that $100,000?
I would rather have buses. Not everybody, a lot of the disabled take it, when you become disabled, you take a hit on income. Mm-hmm. So the idea of taxi chits is nice, but get us enough buses. I know that's not what you asked me, but I think what you need to do is you haven't increased the buses as the disabled population has increased. And you have to. Just as we need it increased, the baby boomers are coming up now, we need it increased.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Councillor Brockington?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Ms. Krautz, for your words here this morning. I don't have a question for you, but I want to flag again for the committee that I'm sure you had a lot of input into this, but your husband submitted a week ago a 12-page submission to this committee with respect to the recommendations that were coming from staff. I encourage, if my colleagues have not yet read the report, to read it, because it's filled with commentary and suggestions directly related to the staff report that's before us. So I just wanted to flag that.
Any further questions for the delegation? No? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll return then to questions of staff, and Councillor Brockington.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. DeMonte, you noted in your report that Council made a decision on amending the bylaw in April 2016, and you indicated that you did not come to terms with a contract with our 2 companies, or at least 15 months later. Why?
There was no particular challenge at them before the operation was up and running. It was also staff's, the time we met, there was no particular challenge. We only had, I think it was 3 meetings till we arrived at a conclusion. So there was nothing untowards, or there was no challenge really. It was just a process that took us that. And Chair, I just want to remind. So when we did agree, it was back. The costs were back time to when they officially became operating, so there was no loss of revenue. There wasn't a delay tactic in any way.
Okay. Line of questioning from Councillor McKenney, you agreed that the 7 cents contribution per ride should be reviewed. How do you envision this happening?
Like with everything else, we could probably, we won't, I made a note of the councillor's recommendation. We do normally go back on an annual basis to discuss with these people, and we'll talk about the levy. Again, I'm always a little hesitant because the mandate you gave me was one without any legislative or regulatory powers, so it is, it is a voluntary levy. That said, I remind you, both partners were very open and more than willing to produce a voluntary levy. We arrived at 7 cents in the first negotiation, so yeah, we could go back and have more discussions, and I'll report back to committee.
Yeah, I would think the bidding should begin at least $1 a ride. I think when you look at the need and demand that exists in the city, and that a taxi charge doesn't start at 0, it starts at $3.45, that amending the surcharge from 7 cents to $1 would be, I think, reasonable. Anyway, just to my questions, you mentioned that the recommendations before us are based on what the public consultation suggested. What were staff's recommendations? Are there any recommendations that you felt were top priorities that are not encompassed in this report?
Chair, again, the context, so we did the public consultation with a whole series of criterion that they had to stick by in the report. I'm just going to refer to it here in the public consultation. Excuse me for a second here. Ability, safe, available, affordable, timely, and sustainable. The workshops, those were some of the key guidelines that came out of that consultation process. From that, we went to a second, second analysis, a feasibility analysis throughout the departments. That was the steering committee's recommendation. They wanted to ensure, are there programs we're already doing? Are there things that should be the responsibility of city departments, and not foolishly take this money from the levy and not continue to increase service, but rather ask those departments to continue, and I'll get to that in a moment. So there was a feasibility analysis, and then ultimately the recommendations you have before you, as per your direction, are less staff recommendation, but that of the steering committee, which included staff, obviously, which included at the time the councillor liaison that led that work, and members of the committees and other accessibility working groups and our accessibility office here at the city. So that's how you came up. That's how these recommendations are before you. So it's more that process. With regards to the elements that are, because the question will come up, well, what about all the There's some very good ones in there. Some the steering committee clearly identified, and when we did our feasibility analysis with the department, say, hey, this is your responsibility, and they escape me now. Sidewalk cuts or maintaining OC Transpo or shelters cleaner, etc. So those departments were tasked to do that, and then ultimately to not lose any of this important work that this community told us. The 29 recommendations, those that you're not other than approving today and the money's going to, the city departments have been tasked in their city municipal accessibility for 2020 to 2025, that all these have to be considered, and we should find them in the city plans as we go back to redo our municipal accessibility plan. So there was like a twofold. So the objective here was to follow council's direction, take this levy and spend it as best and more effectively as possible to increase capacity, what we learned, and the others that weren't retained, city departments have been tasked to take back and add it in our municipal accessibility plan for that period of time.
So are we directing funds only for 1 year?
The direction of funds would be, the recommendation is going for this. No, it's for multiple years.
Okay.
And you're also giving me delegate authority as that goes up to redistribute based on the concepts that have been determined here. The next question, staff has been debating that because it wasn't clear in the direction. Ultimately, this may become stale, and I think at that point we'll have a responsibility to come back to you and say, it's been 3 years, 4 years, this has been working well, or this issue has been resolved. Maybe we should go back to the community, and we would do that with the council liaison to reestablish, again, another working group in 3 years.
And every year the money that we generate presumably will increase. So the reason why I'm concerned with Councillor Eglai's motion is, rather than allocate the funds that we were going to direct to paratrans, other 3 recommendations, I think you should say the next recommendation that is on our list that didn't make this list is X. And we should consider whether we identify a new recommendation to make sure that gets covered off, because these are going to be covered off for years now. And presumably there's going to be more and more resources to go to those recommendations. So I'd rather we increase what we're able to cover than just focus on 3. So can you identify before council the next?
Chair, I guess the challenge with that is the task was for the steering committee to do that, and my other issue is some of the other recommendations analyzed and some of the costs may not fit in. So like, sure. I don't know if these are the top 4, number 5 with the money left may not fit in.
Okay, so let me ask you this. I think I heard you say that we heard from the public that demand for accessible transportation continues to be a challenge. Your first recommendation I really like, because we're identifying in rural area there's a significant issue there, but there's also suburban and urban. None of the other recommendations address demand. So if that's a main issue, if we've just heard from a delegation that there are issues with getting accessible transportation outside of the 9 to 5 range, how are we addressing that main issue through the recommendations that are before us?
Chair, you're right, it doesn't address demand, but it does address capacity. One of the other elements that we heard from the community was, I want to have the capacity like an able-bodied person to, as I gave the example, we can leave and go for lunch, grab a cab, grab an Uber, whatever. I can't do that. And the barrier I have is there are accessible cabs. We talked about a challenge that we're working. That's a management challenge. We have to work that. We believe there's enough accessible cabs. There seems to be a challenge there. We're going to resolve that. But the barrier to take an accessible cab is, from a monetary perspective, is too high. So to your point, so for suburban and urban dwellers, I think if we are giving them more taxi chits, we're lowering that barrier. They do get a benefit. It's not a demand benefit, it's a cost benefit. So, and those were some of the debates, actually. It's interesting because we're rehaving the debates that the steering committee had, and that's why they landed there. They wanted to balance that. There's a rural challenge, there's a para challenge, so let's get the technology up and running, and then how do we meet that other demand that we kept hearing from the community is we want to be like, and even Mrs. Krautz kind of said that as well too, we want to be like able-bodied people to be able to travel around the community. So my challenge with your recommendation, and I understand what you're saying, Councillor Brockington, is like, to go to number 5, I don't know what that means, and we haven't had that discussion, so I'm just a little hesitant. It makes a lot of sense, very logical. What I counter-propose, Madam Chair, is this will, and if you're right, if the fund continues to increase based on trip data, they continue to increase, or I'm successful to go back and negotiate more money, I think then my recommendation to committee would be we would sit with the councillor and the accessibility committee and then review with the new data, the new parameters, the new bucket of money that we would have to do another exercise. That would be my best recommendation to support that community.
Okay. My final question is, can you remind this committee why Uber and Lyft are not legally required to provide accessible transportation?
Chair, there is no, and I'm looking for our colleague, is Valerie around, but there is no requirement we have no authorities under the Municipal Act, and the ADOA legislation does not cover Uber or those types of products. And Council, when we had identified that in our early debate about these PTCs, or vehicles for hire, rather, directed the city clerk to write to the province to ask that, and that hasn't been addressed as well. So there's a legislative gap, for lack of a better term, and legal perhaps can step in with a better explanation, but there's a legislative gap, so they don't need it. So as council's reaction to that was, okay, let's go get a voluntary levy to offset that they're not providing that service, and this is how we reinvest. So that's the background to where we were, and it is several years ago, so it's a good point to remind us how we got here.
Councillor Deans.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Well, I've been sort of involved in this issue for almost 2 decades, I think, and it's evolved a lot. I recall in the early 2000s when we had a paratransport strike, the disabled community in Ottawa was completely housebound because there was not a single accessible taxi cab in the city of Ottawa. And I think that paratransport strike really shone a light on the issue for council, and a realization that that just was not good enough. All of the moves that council has made over the last 2 decades has been with improving the ability of our disabled community to freely move around the city within the limited regulatory parameters that we have to work within. We issued a number of accessible taxi plates free of charge, with the goal of ensuring that we would have a fleet of accessible vehicles. And early on we did, but over time it's been the law of diminishing returns, because over time, for whatever reason, and I don't understand all the reasons, there's enough profit in the sort of, peak hour market that you don't need to run those vehicles on off-peak times. I don't know what it is, or maybe it takes longer. I just think on the demand side we have to have a better understanding of why we don't have an accessible fleet available around the clock all the time, and that really is the key issue that we need to address. I basically agree with the recommendations, the way that they are laid out here. I think the affordability factor is being addressed through the coupons and allowing them to have more coupons and taking down. But where it all falls apart is if the vehicles aren't available. So I think there's a couple of things. One, we did ask, when we did the PTCs, we were looking for legislation that would require PTCs to have an accessible fleet. We don't have that. But we do have a new government in Ontario, and I don't think we have renewed our request to that new government. And I would suggest to you, Madam Chair, as the chair of this committee, and perhaps the mayor, that you get on this issue and you start asking the province of Ontario to provide legislation that would require PTCs to have accessible vehicles in their fleet, or at the very least allow us to more accurately reflect the amount of dollars that we need to provide an accessible fleet in the city through a surcharge, because right now it's voluntary, and I thought we did a fairly good job of getting the 7 cents voluntary on, because they didn't have to pay anything, was the reality. But it's obviously not good enough. So I think the whole issue for us at this point is on the demand side. I think we have to work with the taxis, the union, the association, the brokers. We need to make sure that we have an accessible fleet available, and maybe that's an incentive. Maybe we have to use some of this money to incent having off-peak hours. I don't know what it is. I'm not suggesting I do, but I would like to see you, Mr. DeMonte, bring a series of recommendations back to this committee on how we might effectively address the demand side issues, because that's really it. And then to Councillor Eglay's motion, I actually agree with Councillor Eglay on this. I think the the amount of money that OC Transpo has, they're going to put the money they need in the development of the app. I mean, it's a big monolith over there, right? And they've got a big budget, and they're going to develop an app, and I don't think this $100,000 is really going to make an effective difference. I think it would be better spent actually on these other priorities where we actually change the affordability factor for people that need to use accessible vehicles to move around the city. So I just think I recognize that the steering committee suggested this, and I agree that the app's really important. But if it's going to be funded anyway from OC Transpo, that $100,000 to me is not going to make much difference. They'll probably put the money in they need to do the app development, whether or not they have our $100,000 or not. And so for me, I kind of feel that, you know, when I hear that from Mr. Scrimger, I would rather see the cost of those taxi coupons go down so it's more affordable. And then I think for you, Mr. DeMonte, that we really need to amp up the demand side. We really need to get a commitment that those vehicles will always be available. And there's lots of them, by the way. How many taxi plates, accessible plates, did we issue?
So there's, Madam Chair, there's currently 191 accessible plates.
191. 191 accessible plates. What's that, over 10% of the total fleet? Over 10%, and there's none available? Like, that doesn't make any sense.
Chair, I would concur with them. We had the initial debate. There seems to be a problem on the demand side. We think it's a little outside this debate. We have to resolve it. It may be a managerial or a regulatory problem. I know that our bylaw regulatory, we're looking at that. Once we resolve that, then we'll have a better analysis to see, but I concur with you that those vehicles have 24 hours, 7 days a week for this community, not doing other things and not available, and that's maybe what's going on right now, so we're looking at that.
How long would it take you to come back to this committee with a report on sort of the lay of the land, on what the contributing factors are and what the potential solutions are?
So I'll ask our Director of Bylaw Regulatory Services. We started when we first started hearing from some of you, you'd heard through your constituency, and we had heard it through some of the work we had done with this community, that there seemed to be a challenge there, and we were like, we don't understand. There's this many plates, we know the percentage, we know that population analysis that was done, why aren't they there? The Bylaw Regulatory Services team started looking at this last September, I believe, right, Roger? And we're starting now to get an idea of some of the challenges, and there's going to be intervention. So I would say that once we get a sense of what's going on there, we're meeting with the brokers, we're meeting with the union. Probably sometime in fall we could come back with a good analysis of what happened, what we've done to correct it, and then how that's impacted it, and have we resolved the demand problem, or is there something else that we need to do? We're in that period right now of looking at that.
When's the last time we issued accessible plates?
Madam Chair, if you recall, during the 2016 bylaw, the new vehicle for hire bylaw, staff were directed to issue an additional 4 accessible plates. So those 4 have been issued at this point.
And the other 2?
The other 2, we've had contact with the next available candidates on the waiting list, and both those are pursuing purchasing accessible vehicles at this point, so we're hoping that we'll have those released shortly. The 2 that we had offered the plates to previously came back to us. They have a year to put a vehicle on the road. Both those came back to us and told us that they weren't able to purchase a vehicle. So we had to go to the next 2 on the waiting list.
And have you got a long list of people waiting for accessible plates?
I'm not sure what the current number's at, but yes, it's about 100 drivers on the list.
Okay, so is there any contemplation, and maybe it's for the fall, but is there any contemplation of adding more accessible plates?
Yeah, Chair, I think that's important. You know, that the whole industry and supply demand and the economics and the challenges we had when we were looking at some of that. So we do tread carefully, but I would concur that Chair, we'll come back with that analysis as well in fall to see maybe that's another option. But again, to your earlier comment, with 190 some odd plates out there, why is there a demand problem? That's more my challenge right now from a managerial perspective. I want to resolve that, and then from there, we'll get an idea of what the market challenge is, and then we can perhaps come back with some recommendations.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Lula.
Thank you, Madam Chair. If we do vote for the motion before us, will the removal of these funds delay the development of the app that's currently in development?
Chair, is our colleague from OC still? So here, there you are. I'll ask him to answer.
Madam Chair, no, it would not.
So $100,000 won't make the app be developed any faster?
Madam Chair, no, because we have the other work that we're doing. If that work weren't already on our work plan and this were a new thing, it would have its own scope and timeline. We certainly intend to do all of these functions as one project, as one effort with our vendor and with our staff. Because we're both, it's you know, this is another commitment of something that we had intended to do already. If the funds are available, there's more funds to draw upon. If the funds are not available, we find other ways if we ever bump up against limits of capital funding.
Thank you, Mr. Scrimger. You know, I get a lot of complaints about double charges and other inefficiencies with paratranspo. So to Mr. Fleury's point, it would be really nice to see the scope of the app encapsulate payment so that it's more like an Uber or a Lyft payment where like the onus is on the individual to ensure that that goes through. So that it takes, like the driver is there to drive, and if you're dealing with payment and driving at the same time, problems like double charging and inefficiencies like that become really exacerbated. So I think that some of the things that Mr. Fleury was talking about should certainly be within the scope of this app, and maybe that's more of a comment than a question. Is there an opportunity, and this question to staff, is there an opportunity to invest a portion of the money that we're receiving to help it grow faster, to allow for more meaningful investment in the future? Like, I realize we're going to be getting about $720,000 a year, but if we were to take 10% of that and put it in an investment fund and grow a little bit faster, maybe we might be able to do something more meaningful with it. Is that even within the scope of this fund? Is that something that can be considered?
Chair, that really is with the regulatory requirements, I think, of finance. We could come back. I'd have to consult with our financial people to see if we're allowed to do that and what type of process we'd have to do with that. I'm more than willing to take that offline, go talk to our city treasurer and ask her that question. If we took a percentage off and invested it, would that give us a better return? And I don't know if legally under municipal rules and under financial rules if we're allowed to do that. It's a bit out of my realm, but more than willing to take that offline.
That might not be even something that we're willing to consider, but if we're only getting a certain amount, it would make sense to take a portion of that to see that grow a little bit faster. Maybe we can see some more meaningful change sooner that way. Just a comment, I suppose. Also, and pardon me because I'm new, it costs approximately about $60,000 to retrofit a van to make it wheelchair accessible. Is it within the scope to help that process along? So $1.2 million at $60,000, that's 20 accessible cabs, right? Even to subsidize or help two would make a big difference at this point. From what I'm hearing from our delegation, anyway. Chair,
it's a good question. I mean, so currently we have the fleet. We've got two outstanding, and it's part of the process. So Councillor Deans also brought up the point is that perhaps the money could be an incentive, you know, somehow Perhaps that would be a better model than, you know, their upfit of the vehicle. That's one time once they get it up. So instead, to incentivize them they get more money if they do that type of thing. So I think that's a little more complex. We'd have to take that away, do a bit of analysis to present to you to see which would be the best return investment, but those are options we can look at in the future. I'm just again hesitant. There is a challenge right now that we're hearing where we've got an intervention in the way. I want to see what the solution to that is before we start, you know, adding money that maybe doesn't need to be added because there's a demand problem. Well, why are those vehicles not fulfilling that demand? So want to resolve that if it's a regulatory problem before we ask you to find other solutions.
Yeah, I think that we'd be really interested in taking a look at that and finding innovative ways to make sure that is there. Like, to me, in a city our size, you know, having, what, 196, you said?
Sorry, Madam Chair, 191.
191 cabs. I mean, even if you've got, you know, half of those on and the other half on 12, like, that's a lot of available cabs. And it boggles the mind why there's not one available when someone's looking for it. I think that providing the extra, you know, flexibility to people so that, you know, not all even able-bodied people will take the bus every single day, right? And you know what? Sometimes you have an emergency, and just as our delegation spoke of, you know, if she's going to the hospital and her wants to go with her, and I don't know anybody who has a partner that wouldn't want to be at the hospital with their partner, right? I'm making sure that flexibility is there, and I'd love to see some ways for us to ensure that these cabs are available when people need them. You know, having them all on the same shift doesn't really do much for people. And of course, like, they're kind of defeating themselves if they're all on the same shift and they're not getting calls when the demand is 12 hours later, right? So, I mean, I don't really buy the argument, if there is one to be made, that they're not making enough money on it when they're certainly not available when the demand is there. Really appreciate your time. Thanks.
Thank you. Councillor Kavanagh.
Thank you very much. It's a privilege to drop in here. This isn't my committee, but I am a commissioner on the Transit Committee, so there's some overlap, and so I appreciate hearing about this expansion of service, particularly for the disabled community. And it's about equity. It's about you know, making sure that people have equal access to transportation, and so I appreciate that we're looking at this. And my question is, and pardon me if I don't know if it fits in with the scope of what you're doing, but I have to ask about the gender lens, because we're talking about making things equal and accessible, and I looked at the report. Don't know if I missed something, but I couldn't see any mention of that in terms of the analysis, in terms of putting this forward. Also, in terms of the fund that you're putting together, I hope that there'll be a gender lens on that as well. So if I could have some comments on that. Thank you.
Chair, the lens that was put in this was strictly for the disabled community, which included all members of that community. There wasn't a specific gender lens put on at the time. It is something now that Council, obviously in this new term, again, remember this was an evolution. That said, the representation that we had was broad and across the board. So I would say, just in general sense, I believe that was that certainly was part of what we heard from that community, because they were very well represented across the board. But specific gender lens put on this. It was very much focused on accessibility and allowing that community that have challenges to be, like you or I, capable to travel, commute, and functional members of society as you and I would. So that was more the work that the committee and the steering committee did as well.
I appreciate that, and it is about equity for a community that is currently not equitable, as we've heard from the delegation here. But again, I think there are extra concerns in terms of safety and other factors that we have to look at. And it's also an opportunity in terms of the fund that we put forward, that we look at it in that respect as well. So I do encourage that we do that going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. And Councillor Eagley.
Thank you. Just on a bit of a wrap up on the motion. So just to give some context, my idea for this motion came as a result of an email received from the Ottawa Disability Coalition. And while I acknowledge that that's not the whole of the accessible community, they are a significant stakeholder that we work with. And I believe all of council got this. It was sent March the 18th. So I encourage everybody to have a look at it because it was their suggestion that OC Transpo sort of pick up the ball on this particular piece of the project and go forward with the app. I don't look at it as changing the recommendations, as Councillor Fleury suggested, but enhancing. In effect, what we're doing, if we pass this motion, I think, is we're putting an extra $100,000 back into the pot because OC will pick up the cost of the app development, and that $100,000 that was going to be spent on it can then be shared amongst the remaining three. So rather than having X dollars for each of those, you can have X dollars plus a third of the $100,000, or however the community decides to split that up, but it'll be shared amongst the remaining recommendations, and the fourth recommendation will still be carried out by virtue of the work that Mr. Scrimshaw and his team is going to be doing. So in that regard, I hope that my fellow committee members support the motion. I know in discussions with Councillor McKenney, she's going to be giving direction to staff after discussions with Mr. Scrimshaw, and I'm fully supportive of the direction that she's going to be giving as sort of a, how can I put this, a commitment, if you will, by staff in support of the notion of this motion. So I'm supportive of that as well. So again, I don't see this as changing the recommendation. I see it as enhancing the recommendation, doing something that a significant stakeholder suggested that we do with this funding, and also, as I say, as Councillor Dean said it, if OC has got the money to do it, then that's $100,000 that can be used to address the affordability piece through taxi coupons and that sort of thing. So again, I would hope that with the addition of the direction that Councillor McKenney is going to give, that makes everybody comfortable with this motion, that we're actually enhancing or improving the recommendations that Mr. DeMonte's team brought forward, and not reducing or changing them in any kind of a negative way. So thank you.
Any further questions? Okay. Councillor McKenney. Thank you, Chair. So the direction that I want to give, and I just want to make sure that I'm clear with Mr. Scrimshaw first, because Councillor Luloff has brought it up and Councillor Fleury. So when are we expanding the scope of the second recommendation here to develop a smartphone when we're asking for different aspects to that application, or are you feel comfortable with what we're asking for fits within both your work plan for the self-serve online booking and creating an app, an online app?
Madam Chair, we are comfortable that these services and functions could all be coded up and delivered a package. Though the discussion primarily at the Transit Commission was about online booking, we intend to be looking, as I said, to finding ways customers can get information directly, provide information directly through online and smartphone windows that would remove the need to talk to a customer service agent just to get that information or to make that change or to provide that information. So we'll be looking at all the services that we provide to paratransport customers and automating or putting online or putting into a smartphone app as many as we can. This is one of them, and we're happy to commit to include this in the work that we described to the Transit Commission.
Okay, I appreciate that, and it will also punch it back to Transit Commission, and you can kind of stay there in your own within your own purview once I give the direction. So the direction essentially, quite simply, is for Mr. DeMonte to work with the General Manager of Transportation, Mr. Manconi, to ensure that recommendation 2 to develop the smartphone application is embedded within their work plan.
Thank you very much. Any further questions? Excellent. Well, thank you very much to staff for answering our many questions here today so thoroughly. I believe then we would move on to the motion. Do we need to read this again? Should we
read it again. So again, I'll read the therefores. Therefore be resolved that no funds for higher accessibility fund be allocated to the creation of the para-transpo smartphone application, and be it further resolved that the General Manager of Emergency and Protective Services be given the delegated authority to reallocate the funds for the para-transpo smartphone application, the remaining recommendations outlined in the report.
Thank you very much. Carried? Perfect. Okay. So next then we'll be adopting the report as amended by that motion. Carried? Fantastic. So we have no in-camera items, I'm aware. We do have one IPD, so use of delegated authority during 2018 by Emergency and Protective Services. So we'll receive that. Any notices of motion for consideration at subsequent meeting? Councillor McKenney.
Thank you, Chair. This is on behalf of Councillor Fleury. 50th anniversary celebrations of Vanier. Whereas in 1969, the former city of Eastview was renamed the city of Vanier in honor of his 19th Governor General, Georges Vanier, and whereas 2019 marks the 50th anniversary of this important commemoration, whereas the Vanier community has expressed its wish to mark this occasion with special celebrations, Museo Park Vanier has requested a one-time increase in their 2019 renewable funding to plan and deliver celebration events and programming. Therefore, be it resolved that Museo Park Vanier be with a one-time grant contribution of $35,000 for Vanier's 50th anniversary celebrations, and be it further resolved that this grant be funded in 2019 from the Tax Stabilization Reserve.
Okay, thank you very much. Any other notices of motion? Good. Any inquiries? Other business? Okay, adjourn. Next meeting to be April 18th. Thank you very much.